Hello, my name's Justin McClure, and I'm here today with
Will Sloan.
And you're listening to The Important Cinema Club. And today, we're going back to Hong Kong, which we go to all the time because we love those filmmakers. We're talking about Johnnie To.
And one of the reasons we're talking about him is because there's a big retrospective of his work going on at the TIFF Bell Lightbox here in town. So I think we've both dipped into it, in and out, seen some of the stuff.
They're playing them on 35 millimeter, and the thing about Johnnie To is that he's such a technically proficient filmmaker, even in a place like Hong Kong, which is usually like rushed and make them quick and it looks a little bit cheap, that to see them on the big screen, and we've seen some 35 millimeter archival prints where they're just pristine, is the way that those movies are meant to be seen.
Dan, the way that color looks on film. I've been watching these movies and then I think of all the shot on digital Hong Kong action movies that have come out in my adult lifetime, and it just makes me want to cry.
And that difference between the technical presentation is something that is very personal to me, because when I first started getting into Johnnie To and Hong Kong cinema, these DVDs with his films on them look like shit. Like, they looked really bad. Me and Will saw A Hero Never Dies, and on DVD, all the colors were blown out, so you lose all the detail and anything that was white. When you see it projected, and it looks perfect.
I think I also get a little sad because all the movies today, I sound like Peter Bogdanovich, all the movies today, but like, so much can be color corrected afterwards, and back then they had to fucking make these colors on the set, you know?
Yeah, you had
gels and shit.
Limited time and limited resources to just make it work. And before we get into just like old people complaining about movies today and kids today,
and the sound is so loud.
Let's talk about Johnnie To himself. This is a filmmaker who often gets lumped in with people like John Woo or Choi Hark.
Yeah, he started around the same time as those filmmakers, but he really came into his own after the handover in 1997, when he became kind of the great white hope of Hong Kong cinema. And his best movies are very much a reaction to the John Woo kind of maximalist, super violent style, where his is much more minimalist, much more derived from Jean-Pierre Melville.
And he's playing in the same area with cops and robbers and super cool heroes who can do almost everything. But the thing about Johnnie To cinema, and you realize this the more that you watch, is that he's all about like deconstructing those things and kind of playing with the form and the way that they're presented. For example, we saw a movie called A Hero Never Dies, and on the cover of it, it looks like all the heroic bloodshed, gun in each hand, fist-pumping film that, as someone who's getting into John Woo, you want Hong Kong to deliver more of those things. And what the film actually ends up being is that up to a point, because Johnnie To films, almost always when they start, it's all about these super awesome people who are, for all intents and purposes, invincible and can do anything. And then what Johnnie To does is he kind of breaks that. And where do they go from there?
I think he's also much less romantic about, you know, the Hong Kong triads and the mobsters. A movie like his Election series is very much about how there's really no honor among thieves, whereas the John Woo movies are so much about, you know, loyalty, honor, brotherhood, not much deeper than that, but like those big gold-plated ideas.
But at the same time, Johnnie To is also a director who is in love with the grand melodramatic gestures, just like John Woo. Like, again, going back to Hero Never Dies, that film is filled with like, look how big this is. It's not meant to be realistic, but I want it to just be a wave that crashes on the audience.
Two things about Johnnie To and my relationship to him. One of the things that I think is interesting about Johnnie To is he's one of those filmmakers who personifies the difficult relationship between art and commerce. He's a guy who runs his company, Milkway, and to keep his company afloat, he has to direct a lot of movies that are impersonal to him. So he directs Cantonese comedies for the Lunar New Year season, which is like their summer blockbuster season.
Like romantic comedies, he just kind of churns them out, and he's publicly said that those films are compromised and that he does them just to keep his company going.
And most of them don't even come out here. We don't see them. The movies that we love here, his gangster movies, are generally not that successful in Hong Kong. But those are the ones he cares about. And also, now that the Hong Kong film industry has more or less been swallowed up by the mainland Chinese film industry, and he's somebody who is dealing with
censorship.
And if he wants to make a movie in the mainland, he can't depict the triads like he used to. He has to follow censorship rules. And when you read him interviewed, for example, the interview he gave to Cineast magazine recently, he thinks that all of his mainland productions, even the ones that people over here love, like Drug War, he thinks that they're irredeemably compromised, basically.
And Johnnie To's saying that does have more weight because he did start in the factory line of filmmaking. Like in the 70s, into the 80s, he was working on TV shows. He cut his teeth on shows like The Legend of the Condor Heroes, which is a big TV show that happened, before going into those comedies and melodramas, most famously All About Ah Long, which was a film that starred Chow Yun-fat and had no action, no big comedic beats, was the Kramer versus Kramer of Hong Kong.
I've heard that movie posited as an important film in his career because it's a movie where his camera sort of breaks free. It's a movie where he starts doing inventive things with tracking shots and stuff like that.
If we're talking about Johnnie To, the one thing that you can find in all these films, even though he's working in every genre, is that they are specifically his movies. Like the way that he shoots them, the themes that he deals with, all have a little bit of him inside of it.
And what is that? Because I don't always see it, to be honest.
So on a technical level, his love of things like wide-angle lenses, technicranes, long shots are present in almost everything. And in the kind of subtextual level, like I said before, I think that what interests him a lot are these moral and societal structures and the way that they can kind of be dismantled and how do you get away from that. For example, Office, which was a semi-sequel to All About All Long because it stars both of the same people and deals with the same thing, which is the economic growth of China and how they're dealing with it. In Office, which is like this big budget musical shot on all these crazy sets, what the film is about at the end of the day is that you have to sell your soul to succeed, and anybody that tries to do differently will be crushed and be thrown away.
It was interesting for me to read him, all but disown his mainland productions, because his mainland productions, like Office, are like they're very smart. They're very much interrogating what you're allowed to show in a mainland production and why. So like this week I rewatched Drug War, his big movie about kind of this cat and mouse game between a big mainland drug lord and the
tenacious police detective after him.
Yeah, and the two of them forming an uneasy alliance so that the drug lord can get a reduced sentence. It's a movie that, spoiler, but it ends with this really bleak and horrifying shot of the drug lord getting a lethal injection.
So we should explain to people that don't know the way that Chinese censorship works, and even me and Will, we just know it from a distance, is that like the villains cannot get away with it. They must be punished at the end, and if any hero does something bad and even comes to the side of good at the end, he must be punished as well. And there's no way around that. So the second you see a villain on screen, if it's a mainland Chinese production, that person will be punished by the end of the movie.
Now, the way that the villain gets the lethal injection at the end of the movie, there's nothing cathartic about it.
It's horrifying.
It's horrifying, and it's how the movie ends. And I'm really not entirely sure how to feel about it, because you can sense Johnnie To being like, okay, this is what I have to do, here it is. But at the same time, there's nothing in it to make the censors object.
No, and
like it is horrible, and it may and if you were a drug lord watching it, the message that you would get is crime doesn't pay, bitch.
And Johnnie To himself has said that the censorship, the way that it works is he has no direct contact with them other than mail. So he sends in his scripts, and then they send him back notes that they have months later. And that's the way that they work.
And it's interesting, too, like the censors can be very arbitrary in China. Like Jia Zhangke's film, A Touch of Sin, from a few years ago, which was, like about as subversive as it gets for a mainland production, showing the terrible conditions that the working class live in China. That was a movie that was approved by the censors, basically until it went onto the festival circuit.
And people started writing about it.
People started writing about it, and then the censors were like, actually, you can't release this movie.
Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah.
But maybe it's because Johnny To did work so much in the industry that maybe he has a little bit of clout than other people has. Because, like, after All About All Long, he became, like, a Choi Hark light. He worked with Choi Hark on things like The Big Heat, which is an ultra-violent, like, gunplay film. He made The Barefooted Kid, which is a very kind of postmodernist kung fu film inspired by, like, Shaw Brothers Chang Cheh films. He directed a bunch of Stephen Chow comedies, The Mad Monk and Justice My Foot.
Do you see any of the Johnny To you love in those Stephen Chow comedies?
Only in the way that he shoots and puts together movies. I could be shown a film and someone would go, who directed this film? And I would go, oh, Johnny To. In the same way that you could recognize a film directed by Brian De Palma, in that he has particular things that obsess him in the way that he can tell a story, and those are present over and over again. But the difference between Brian De Palma is that I love Brian De Palma, but, like, he goes back to the same, bag of tricks over and over again. While Johnny To, for example, is obsessed with long oneers. This could be seen in a film like Sparrow, where you are introduced to all the pickpockets in one long take on a Hong Kong street, or something like Breaking News, which is the intro to all the characters, and then the gunfight that happens after in one long, unbroken 7-minute take.
His cinema, like, visually is very, like, mathematical. He's very interested in the way bodies can be arranged in space. He's always using every part of the frame. He's using all the planes in the frame. There are many shots in his movies where it'll be like 7 or 8 gangsters all in the CinemaScope frame at the same time, in different levels. And he's interested in the way they move. So there's a scene in Drug War that struck me this time where there's an exchange of drugs that takes place in traffic during a red light, where the inspector, undercover as a drug dealer, runs to another car and drops off a suitcase. And the way the camera kind of follows him through these cars, and the camera is always making a note of, in this traffic jam, there are like 3 or 4 cars you need to know. And it does it in a very unshowy way, kind of laying out where all the chess pieces are on this chessboard.
I think that the pleasures of Johnny To is something that as a teenager, when I saw A Hero Never Dies, I didn't understand, because I wanted a film like John Woo. And to a certain point, A Hero Never Dies is like John Woo, but he's more interested in that film when an action scene breaks out, in how can he present this differently than you would usually see it. And you can very clearly delineate, like, in this action scene of Hero Never Dies, it takes place on a dark street with 2 groups of people shooting each other from the cars. In this scene, everybody is on the roof of the building they're in, and they don't know who's shooting at them. Or in this scene, the gag is that everybody being shot is flying over the tables like they're doing some kind of choreographed dance.
But I must say, A Hero Never Dies felt more like John Woo than I expected it to. It had more kind of visceral energy to it. Like, it has scenes where the camera, as a tracking shot, just like swoops through the hospital and up the stairs, and that's something that, like, the camera moves throughout his movies, but it never calls attention to itself in quite that, like, Scorsese-ish way.
I would say that he actually does that a lot, but you usually don't notice it, or it's one of the films that he's made a conscious decision, like The Mission or Exiled, where I'm doing this in a very careful style where I don't want to call too much attention to myself. Like A Hero Never Dies, which is a story about, like, 2 amazing, I guess, hitman / bodyguards and the bond that they have and the way that affects their lives, is one of those Johnny To films. Like, I watch so many, and they all have these same themes of these superhuman characters. Like, they're introduced from the beginning, making impossible shots, or at one point, one of them has a laser sight on his head, and he doesn't even see it, and he just, like, realizes it's there. Like, that's how awesome they are. And then, like, what if we took everything away from them? How would they react from that point on? So it's a mixture of, like, I'm going to take this well-worn premise and go at it from a different angle, but at the same time, he's going to give you, like, what you expect.
Right. But whereas The Mission, which came out maybe a year or 2 later, and which I think is probably the most revolutionary film in terms of defining his style, it strips out all that kind of over-the-top emotion, and the characters are much more inward, and visually, it almost becomes like a long series of these static tableaus that are each building blocks, and juxtaposed next to each other, they create, a remarkable effect. But it's like there's not a lot of wild camera work. There are interesting tableaus that that make a dynamic use of the space within that one shot and then juxtaposed next to each other.
When Johnny To talks about like how he shoots a gunplay scene, he said that every bullet counts, and that can be seen in the mission where these gunplay scenes play out, like Will said, in these long tableaus with the actual moments where bullets are fired mean something big. Like, scenes don't just end, they reach a climax.
I often don't find myself particularly excited during his movies. They don't raise my pulse. Oftentimes they're more interesting to observe. So there's a scene in Exiled, which is a movie that I saw for the first time this week, when it's kind of a long shot of this apartment complex as you see the shootout happening in the apartment complex, almost like a shot from Playtime or something, where you see people like in different rooms and they're running down the stairs and the camera kind of follows them from a distance down the stairs. I don't want to say there's no energy, but it has a very particular kind of energy where it's just more an interesting image than it is something to get your pulse racing.
I would almost associate that with a phenomenon I've seen here or there, which is it's a filmmaker who distinctly understands what they're doing when it comes to cinema and wanting to move beyond that.
Right.
Like, if Johnny To wanted to give you, like, a pulse-pounding, like, edge-of-your-seat gunfight, he could easily do that. Like, he worked in the commercial sphere for so long, but he's reached a point in his career where he's like, what else can I do differently?
Right. Well, one of the movies I saw this month at the retrospective was The Heroic Trio, which I was surprised to realize I'd never seen all the way through before, but it was a wacky female superhero movie from Hong Kong in the 90s, which has Michelle Yeoh, Maggie Cheung, and Anita Mui, I think. It's like exactly what you would want from a movie like this, you know, full of wackiness and people, you know, fast camera movements and crazy edits. And
like, it's Choi Hark.
Yeah, it's
like,
Choi
that's
Hark.
what Johnny To is doing in that film, working with Chin Soo Tung, who was like the go-to person for like Flying Swordsman. And it's one of those films that when it was released for a long time was the touchstone when it came to like Hong Kong action cinema. The look how crazy this is. There's motorcycles being shot with like a boomerang through the air, and at the end they fight like a desiccated corpse of the master supervillain
with stop motion effects and everything. And it also is like full of hashtag problematic stuff, like when one of the Heroic Trio heroically like blows up a bunch of the like children who have been kidnapped because they're like, these kids haven't been socialized, you know, they're not they won't be able to live a normal life. Or what about the baby who dies?
Yeah, when its head lands on a nail.
Oh, God.
Yeah, that's why it feels like Johnny To, he did all this stuff, and if you look at his cinema as it went along, especially the projects that were the most personal to him, he's basically stripping dialogue out of the films.
Oh, yeah.
And telling them in a visual way, to the point that the way that the music and the visuals interact, they are essentially musicals without musical numbers.
A lot of them don't even need dialogue. You could take the dialogue out and just have it be like a pantomime silent film.
There's one of his films, Throwdown, which is about like a judo champion. There are whole segments of his films that are just driven by the music, and that's all you have. And he said that that film was inspired by Akira Kurosawa. Then you have a film like Sparrow that is 100% inspired by the work of people like Jean-Luc Godard in his early period, or by Jacques Demy in his musicals. The climax of that film is a contest between two pickpocket gangs where they're just walking across the street and they have to pick each other's pockets, and it's played like the most suspenseful thing in slow motion, and is just a craftsman and artist at the top of his game that he can pull that off. And that's a film that he just wanted to make so badly. They shot it over 5 years whenever they had breaks shooting other films.
And then there are movies like the Johnny Hallyday vehicle, Vengeance, which I think was a movie. Did he make that with French money? It must have been, right?
Vengeance is almost like a primer for dummies to Johnny To. Yeah. Like, we want to sell Johnny To on an international stage. What are the things that we perceive people really like? Let's put them all in one movie and try to kind of release it internationally.
You know, Alain Delon was supposed to be in that movie.
That would have been crazy.
It would have been great. But, but like Johnny Halliday's fine in it. And that's a movie. And Exiled is a movie where like all of the character of the actors is sort of drained away, like in a sort of Jean-Pierre Melville or dare I say Bresson style, where it's like they are stripped to their base elements, and I guess the charisma from them is supposed to just come from the fact that they are very still and cool, you know.
But I think that even when we're dealing with that kind of coolness in Johnnie To's film, and he always sets it up right from the beginning, there's a level of kind of camaraderie and friendship between characters in the best of his film. Like The Mission, which we talked about before, those big tableaus, oftentimes what is being sold in them is that friendship between these guys hanging out. Like, there's one long scene where they're just waiting for someone, and they start to kick a piece of garbage between each other. And as it goes along, and you see that playfulness, and that playfulness is something that you see in a lot of films to define the characters beyond their I could make the impossible shot.
Well, I like Johnnie To a lot, but I think one reason why he's never become a filmmaker who I felt the need to see every single movie of is because he's always been a little cold to the touch for me.
Yeah, I've never felt that.
Yeah.
I can understand why you would feel that way, because his films are, like you said, mathematically calculated. But in his best films, and he's made a lot of films, and some of them not that good, that they can connect that level of kind of friendship between the characters, that it allows me to get into it and care about what's happening. The funny thing about Exiled is, I know you watched it very recently, and that you did find it cold, right?
Yeah, I liked it, but it just didn't. It held me at arm's length for the whole thing.
What's interesting about Exiled, it is a meta sequel to The Mission. So, like, I bet Johnnie To, the way that he approached it was, it's continuing these characters' stories, but not really. So the emotion that you would have invested in The Mission would then transfer to Exiled, because it's all the same cast.
That's it. Well, I mean, I liked seeing all of these, like, Hong Kong legends like Simon Yam and Anthony Wong, and of course the chubby guy who's always in
Lam Suet,
yeah.
Who was a grip in a movie, and suddenly he got a role, and since then he became part of that, like, Johnnie To ensemble.
Whenever he shows up in a Johnnie To movie, I smile a little bit.
He's in every Chinese movie now. But I'm also talking about Johnnie To in the sense that, like, he's this great, like, auteur who his style goes from, like, every movie that he makes. But I'd be remiss not to say that one of the things that he does in his productions through Milkway is a collaborative effort. Like, a dozen of his films are actually co-directed with his writer, Y Cafe. And, like, he said multiple times that, like, the way that he breaks down films and they bring ideas is done as a group. Like, all his films have, like, 9 credited writers, and he says there's actually more than that, because they all sit in a room like a TV show and break the story and then break the beats.
So the films that he makes with Wakafe, how much do you sense he regards those as personal films?
I think that he does regard them as personal films in different ways. If you look at something like Running on Karma, the thing that Wakafe brings to it is a level of weirdness that is not always in Johnnie To films, because Running on Karma is a film where Andy Lau, the biggest pop star ever in China, wears a muscle suit and is a stripper, and he fights supervillains and is also a detective, but the entire film hinges on the idea that there's a woman that he falls in love with that he cannot save, so she dies, and he discovers at the end, I don't want to get into too many spoilers, that the only way that he can be at peace is by accepting the cycle of life and the way that karma works. And that's, like, the ultimate Johnnie To example, is that these superhumans are always kind of crippled as the movie goes on, and you don't always get what you want, but by the end, in most of them, they achieve a level of either peace or understanding or happiness, even if it ends with them losing everything or their death.
So I'm interested to see where his career goes from here, though, because he seems very ambivalent about where he's at right now, because he talks about how, when he's interviewed on the matter, he can make a choice between making a personal film for no money in Hong Kong or a much more spectacular film, irredeemably compromised in the mainland. He's got a company to keep afloat.
But looking at his IMDb, he was so busy right after the handover, making film after film after film, and it's just slowed to a crawl, to the point that his last picture, 3, which came out 2 years ago,
I didn't love.
I didn't like either. Yeah. There's been no follow-up to that, and there's nothing on the horizon either.
Watching Drug War this time, I really like Drug War. It feels like a much more conventional movie than something like The Mission. It's much more of a straight-up kind of commercial thriller, but that's okay. I mean, it really works.
Yeah.
But I was more conscious of the mainland holds on it. I was more conscious of the fact that it's partly an anti-drug propaganda piece. And, we can say and I actually believe it, that it's interesting to watch Johnnie To wrestle with that and try to interrogate that. And I think he does a good job with it. But at the end of the day, it's not that subversive.
No,
you know?
It's not. What Johnnie To in that film is specifically trying to do, I feel, is just give a more well-rounded portrait to everything that's going on. Mm-hmm. Like, in the early scenes, they capture a busload of people who are going through the country with drugs up their ass.
Right.
And he holds on a woman weeping and trying to shit as, like, police coldly watch her doing this.
Yeah.
And you can feel Johnnie To going, like, these are not villainous people. Like, they go through pain. Like, they're doing this for...
But then I could also see a Chinese censor look at it and be like, good for you, Johnnie To. You showed what happens to these people.
And that's the perfect kind of, like, balancing act that he has to play. Maybe he's just tired of playing that.
Anyway, it's not like he's Choi Hark, just, you know...
That sold out?
Just sold out and is kind of soullessly making propaganda films now. He's a much more interesting filmmaker than that. But I still can't help feel a little bittersweet about a movie like Drug War.
I understand where you're coming from.
But even though I think it's a really good movie.
I do think that what's missing from the way that we talk about Johnnie To are some, like, straight ahead film theorists and academics talking about him in a context that's not directly linked to the fact that he makes popular movies. And I think that what kind of hobbles him a lot too is that he has made so many movies that people feel, you know, a little bit out of their depths to talk about him, which is the reason that in the English language there's one book written about him,
really,
and nothing else.
That's interesting because I think academia likes him. I know I've read, you know, I took a Chinese film class and there was a fair amount of talk about him.
Yeah, people,
just what he's doing visually with editing.
But like the fact that he hasn't become like a household name beyond, oh, Johnnie To, he made like good crime films. He does cool stuff. I feel that there's like, we're on the precipice of just getting to the point where people are highlighting like the ones that are like classics, that are masterpieces, and letting people know you can watch these versions. Like the day Criterion releases a Johnnie To film is the day that I feel that cineasts start talking about him in a different way.
Vengeance was in the official competition at Cannes.
Yeah, but that movie's not that good. So it's okay.
He's got some institutional recognition.
He does. And just before we stop talking about him, if I wanted to recommend some pictures that he's directed and you want to go into his filmography, I would have to say that you should watch The Mission, which we've talked about a lot, because that is the first go-to one. And then I would say watch one of his romantic comedies like Needing You, which is Andy Lau and Sammy Chang in this like crazy office comedy, still shot in the style that he does all of his other stuff. Or Throwdown, which I mentioned, which was the judo film, and it's a different way to approach kind of the action picture. Lifeline is a lot of fun. It's like the ultimate fireman movie in the way that like Backdraft never could be, because in Lifeline it's real. Like these fire stunts are actually happening. Or if you just want something that's easy to digest, Running Out of Time, which is one of those like perfectly calibrated blockbuster films, which is about like a cop having to face off against a master criminal who is one step ahead of him every time. But this master criminal is played by the incredibly charming Andy Lau, and he's also dying of cancer, so that's playing into it. So any of those films, if you want to get started to see like who he is, those are perfect ones to jump into.
Man, have you ever seen Wu Yan? This is one of his Lunar New Year comedies from the early 2000s. It was interesting to watch a Johnnie To movie that looked that shitty.
Oh, really?
Just visually, yeah. But it, like, yeah, kind of like a historical farce.
Yeah,
you know.
That is for Chinese audiences and Chinese audiences
over
only.
2 hours.
Yeah. Oh my god.
Oh man.
So, if you want to contact us, our email address is importantcinemaclubpodcast@gmail.com. This week on our Patreon, we talked about the career of megastar Mark Hamill in honor of him taking the lead role in an upcoming little film called Star Wars. We ended up watching a film called Midnight Ride, a 90s Mark Hamill as a serial killer vehicle.
From Canon Films.
And Corvette Summer, which was his direct follow-up to Star Wars, which is famous for tanking his career. So for $5, you can listen to that episode and every episode we've done before that.
Yeah.
And I have to say this, that from last episode onward, at filmtrap.com, I'm adding more show notes and like trailers and lists of the movies we talk about. So if you're like, these dudes just talk way too fast and I didn't have time to have a pen and paper, go to that website and you'll find a listing of all that stuff. And subscribe to the newsletter if you want, because we post tons of stuff
What Justin really needs is a wealthy benefactor.
Yes, if a patron would like to give us $5,000 a month.
If there's a rich widow out there who needs a husband.
Picture us as the James Joyce of Two White Guys Talking About Film podcasts and become our patron.
Yes.
Next week, it's starting to become the holiday season, Will. So we're going to take it easy and have ourselves a little party.
Yeah.
When you think Christmas movies, what Christmas movie do you think of?
Oh, Ernest Saves Christmas, of course.
A picture that I have never seen.
What?
I've never seen it.
Oh my God.
Yep, that's right. So we're going to throw a little bit of a party, and we're going to watch Ernest Save Christmas together with Emily Milling and Matthew Kumar of Loose Cannons fame and the bully on the previous episodes he's appeared with of Will Sloan. And we'll be watching Jingle All the Way, Ernest Save Christmas, Home Alone 2, and Scrooged.
You're springing that on me right now for the first time.
You've seen Home Alone 2. You've seen Scrooged.
Yeah.
So you don't need to watch them again. You can talk about them. So make sure to tune in next week. It'll be a big party. And I want to start teasing our December 25th episode because we release these at the beginning of every week. So Christmas actually falls on a Monday. And I promise that we will get it out on the Monday. And it's going to be a special Christmas surprise that I'm not going to tell you guys what it is. You're going to have to come in on December 25th, Christmas, to see what the episode will be.
Spend Christmas with your real family, the Important Cinema Club.
My name's Dustin McClue.
I'm Will Sloan.
Thanks for listening. So I was recently doing research online about Canadian cinema. It's a topic that actually got kind of fired up in me when we did our episode years ago on Paul Gross.
Ah, yes.
Which is that I picked up a book on the Canadian Film Awards, or the Genies as they used to be called, and while flipping through it was like completely taken aback about how many films I hadn't heard about, and then doing research found were not available at all. And there was one of those films, Loyalties, that was nominated for 8 awards, and I found its photo in the book that I always wanted to see and never could because it wasn't available. And recently it popped up on TIFF's 150 list, and I did some research, like, when did they play it? I probably missed it. And I found that it was playing on Saturday, and I could not go.
I went, though.
And how did you find it?
I was very impressed by it. This is a movie that I had not heard of until you mentioned it to me a week ago. Mm-hmm. And it's the story, it's by
Anne Wheeler, yeah.
Yeah, and it's the story of a sort of well-to-do British couple who move to rural Canada so that he can start his dental practice. And the wife feels very much like out of her depth, and she really feels kind of bullied into it by her husband. And meanwhile, they hire a local Métis woman as their just servant. Mm-hmm. And the unlikely friendship that emerges between the two women, who are have both been in different ways victimized by the men in their lives, and how
they bond.
Yeah, they bond. What else is there to say? But I thought it was just a very impressive movie. The way that it kind of showed this unlikely friendship forming, I don't know. I can't put it into words.
I was able to find a copy this week because I was like, I can't believe it's playing. I wonder if it's available anywhere else. And I did find one. There's a version on YouTube. It looks terrible if you want to watch it.
Oh, it looked great on 35 millimeter.
And I wouldn't recommend watching it there. And what it is, like Will was saying, is like a low-key, plotless film about like the relationship between these two people and the kind of unavoidable climax that it comes to, which is harrowing. And at the end, the entirety of it is something that is surprisingly moving, especially where it starts and where it ends up.
And it also shows just how similar kinds of abuse can pop up in different and unexpected ways, and can affect people from all over the class system, you know?
And I think that one of the most horrifying things when it comes to this film is the fact that, like, you can't watch it in any available version. That article I was researching I actually went through, like, I keep a list of Canadian cinema and what's available and what's not, and I basically posted a big chunk of it. The fact that as a country, we're just like, man, this has no value, so we're just not going to care about it anymore.
Well, as I was watching this movie, on a Saturday afternoon free screening at the Lightbox with, I don't know, 15 other people in the audience, I thought that, like, there is a challenge in marketing this movie, but I sort of feel like in this climate, you could sell a movie by a female filmmaker about a female relationship, and that also it touches on issues of abusive relationships, touches on Indigenous stories, and it's a great movie. and all of that, you would be able to sell it as a movie in this particular cultural moment.
Yeah, and selling it is like a strong word, because when I start talking very animated about Canadian cinema to people, and I'm like, oh man, it would be amazing if they took even a film like Loyalties and like did a proper transfer, like scanned a print that looks good, or even a negative.
It makes me feel sad that people listening to this might watch the YouTube version, because seeing it on a 35mm print, like, there are so many beautiful magic hour shots. Like, it's a real movie, for God's sake.
And that's the thing, is that Canada as a country has just dismissed Canadian film entirely. I mean, Will has said it. I have said it multiple times in my life. And like, when I posted that article, some person just replied like, Canadian films suck. They're all about boring stuff and suicide.
Well, I don't know. With this one, I think there is a way to get people interested. I think people are genuinely sincere in that they want to see movies by female filmmakers.
Yes.
I think people are sincere that they want to hear other kinds of stories told, like Indigenous stories. And the way you sell it is to say, you want those things. Here's a great movie you've never heard of and that you will have a great experience with. I don't know. Canadian films pose a challenge because we all know that there are like the 10 or 15 that everyone knows.
Hey, you ever heard of the movie Cube?
Yeah, Cube. And like, Cube's an example of like, oh, that's the fun one that we put on the list. And just seeing it over and over again makes your heart sink a little bit, because it makes you think, oh yeah, Cube. That's our fun movie.
Yeah, which is fine.
Which is fine. Videodrome. That's another one of our fun movies. But it's like, it makes you think that the canon is very shallow.
And it's not.
Yeah.
The canon is actually very deep and filled with like super impressive motion pictures. But like I said before, they're just not available. Like, recently I've gotten kind of hooked on the idea of, why aren't these films available in libraries? Because libraries are one of the only places these days that people wander into and go like, what do they have? This looks interesting.
Yeah.
Why won't I watch that? And that while library is undeniably a class thing, that like upper class people like don't go to libraries. And I mean, someone can email me and say that's not true, like I go, but the fact of the matter is, like, a lot of people just go like, oh, I don't need to use libraries, like I have everything on my computer, why would I go there?
Like, who are the people who are cutting library funding? It's upper class people who don't use it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, there still is libraries?
Yeah.
When like they need to exist because it allows that browsery kind of feeling of, oh, I'm gonna watch this or even read this book that I've never heard about. And the fact that even that these movies are not available in libraries is probably the biggest stumbling block to, from that point, you can start getting it outward a little bit more, because once it becomes present, then it, people start watching it, and then you have to get it on like actual streaming sites like Netflix, and then people stumble upon that, and so on and so forth, and get people talking about it. The thing about like TIFF doing these screenings is,
I don't want to criticize TIFF too much, because it's great that they put on this
it's amazing.
Screening. It's great that they put on the screen, but there's something about the fact that it's a free screening in the afternoon that kind of makes you think, oh yeah, well, it sounds like work, because if it was good, why would it be for free?
And TIFF did an amazing, if you go on their website, they did like a top 150 just Canadian stuff in general, commercials, music videos, films, and there's like essays written about every film and stuff like that. But you will only discover that if you specifically go looking for that thing. There's that, we're making it available, but we don't want to advertise it because we know no one will come anyway.
Okay, here's my proposal. Do a retrospective of Canadian female filmmakers.
Yes.
And don't just do Deepa Mehta.
No.
Like, don't just do Sarah Polley. Like, I think if you did like a whole retrospective, I actually think there is an appetite for this.
I think so too. Yeah. And I think that there's an appetite as well for something that is important artistically. You sell it as, you've never seen these films. These films are not available. Like, and these are important. And they were ignored back then, but now they're like, look at them and how good they are.
And also, they're not work.
Yes.
You're going to like them.
You're good. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.